Okay, this is our Ruyer reading group, returning from a couple weeks off, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. I had put in my notes that we are on page 125 of the translation. I hope that's correct. But yeah, so we're going through, I think we're just a little ways into the chapter on past, future, and cybernetics. So some of what he's discussed in this chapter is the relationship between cybernetics or the notion of information and entropy being obviously very important in cybernetics and also in thermodynamics. And some physicists or philosophers of physics had suggested that there's a sort of intrinsic or like essential connection between the notion of information and time. So, for example, attempts to identify the arrow of time, the fact that there's a sort of intrinsic difference between the past and the future, with the increase of entropy in a closed thermodynamic system. So the direction in which entropy increases is the direction forward in time. These are sort of like intrinsically linked concepts. And then Ruyer points to some passages from Wiener where he suggests that cybernetics involves a kind of like reverse direction in the sense that the information in a cybernetic system, you have information being used to sort of regulate the system or control how the system operates, and this sort of negates the increase of entropy. So where a closed thermodynamic system sort of degrades in order. You start out with the presence of some sort of order or organization or structure, and then over time that order dissipates and the system returns to whatever the most probable state is. So like a very simple example is like you have a metal bar, you heat one end, now you have this sort of order. You have one end of the bar has a higher temperature than the other. This is a sort of improbable state. And then you remove the heat source, the bar will gradually equalize in temperature, and then you just have a disordered system where every part has the same property or the same temperature in this case. Yeah, and then so Ruyer talks about these sort of attempts to link information and time, and he's critical of these sort of identifications. So he talks about like the sort of thermodynamic arrow of time argument, and he points to the fact that, for example, we can watch a recording, a video recording, in his case, a film, where you film a process and of say a thermodynamic process, like burning a piece of paper. You can film that process and then play the film backwards, and we are capable of perceiving that something is being shown backwards. You have a pile of ash that sort of recombines into a piece of paper, and if the arrow of time and the increase of entropy were these sort of like intrinsically connected concepts, or even just sort of identical with each other, it shouldn't be possible for us to even perceive this sequence where the entropy is decreasing, where this disorganized pile of ashes is assembling into a structured piece of paper. Like, I don't know what you would expect to happen. It would be, maybe it's like sort of the Westworld thing where it doesn't look like anything to me. But in any case, it shouldn't be possible for us to like perceive this, backwards flow of increase of entropy. And so it seems that there's something, that there's a distinction, at least in terms of like perceivability or conception, between this arrow of time and the increase of entropy. So we can't sort of identify the two with each other. And he also talks about relativity, where so relativistic physics, of course, involves the sort of linking of space and time, where in Newtonian physics you have the three-dimensional space is this empty box in which everything happens, and then you have this one dimension of time, which is sort of added on as these sort of two separate kinds of dimensions in which the processes of the world happen. Whereas, of course, in relativistic physics, space and time are sort of interchangeable in the sense that something can be uh, maybe interchangeable is not the right word, but a better way of putting it is that there's no sort of separation between a three-dimensional box of space and a one-dimension track of time. Instead, you have this sort of four-dimensional framework where you can't sort of separate out space and time from each other, except locally. So you can, in one section, in one place, you can say, here's the time evolution happening in this place. But you can't sort of move that time track to a different spatial location in the same way as you can for Newtonian physics. So instead, you have to account for the actual motion. So in Newtonian physics, you can just sort of, in like an ideal or abstract sense, you can take the time track happening here and sort of displace it to the time track happening, I don't know, on the surface of Venus or something. Whereas in relativistic physics, you actually have to account for the physical movement. In this case, the movement of a beam of light, for example. So something that is separated in space and time greater than by a greater distance than a beam of light would be able to travel in that time span is sort of outside the realm of possible causal relationship with what's happening here and now. And so we have this concept of a light cone. But Ruyer points out that this sort of relativistic, fusion of space and time still kind of relies on being able to identify, earlier and later at one space-time locate or at one sort of location in this four-dimensional, framework. So I have to still be able to say that this event happened first and then this other event happened later. In my current location, and then I can sort of use the relativistic framework to figure out, what someone at a different location might observe, and that order might not be the same at a different location. But it's still like I still have to sort of pin this four-dimensional trajectory through space-time onto what's happening here and now for me that I can observe. And so you don't get away from this sort of intrinsic experiential process of the flow of time happening here. So yeah, we're still left with this kind of with the need to deal with a conscious observer, or at least some sort of experience of time, and we can't sort of reduce time to some kind of like physical variable in the way that maybe a more scientific approach to relativity would want to do, where we would just sort of say that we can explain the appearance of a flow of time just as something that arises as a result of these physical processes, etc. So yeah, he's criticizing attempts to sort of explain away the experience of time as arising or resulting from some sort of process, whether that's through this information sort of explanation like in thermodynamics, or some sort of relativistic kind of signaling explanation in terms of the transmission of a light beam or something. Okay, so yeah, we can start into the text from I think we're at the heading enveloped time and enveloping time.
I can read. Enveloped time and enveloping time. There's one last point to clarify before drawing conclusions from this discussion. Psychological action, which organizes and forms, is the source of the past future. But while psychological action taken separately and individually would indeed produce a past future, it would not produce the continuous, seemingly impersonal past future of everyday experience. A performed action has a past and consequently a future, but a future that has no reason to be regularly followed by another future. The time of the action is just an isolated impulse. The past future of an action is a kind of pure quality, a raw material that is indispensable and fundamental to the past future of daily, but which alone would be as far from daily time as quantum physics is from ordinary physics, and moreover, for similar reasons. It is thus easy to understand why, when a psychologist who is determined to retrieve the immediate data of consciousness, or a phenomenologist driven by the will to set aside explanations and theories in order to return to things themselves, confronts lived time, this psychologist or phenomenologist does not find a linear dimensional. There is no continuous flow, no instants or intervals regularly ordered like points on a line, no empty time with an already prepared past future in which conscious action takes place, as in space. The psychologist or phenomenologist is perfectly right. Actual experience coincides with the present, but should not be with the abstract notion of the present moment. Actualization is not a linear past, forward arrow, present arrow, future. For actualization is real existence itself, while the past arrow, present arrow, future line is only a schematization. But the phenomenologist goes too far if he believes he can eliminate all past future from his descriptions. He finds them under synonyms. Husserl's quote-unquote retention and quote-unquote protension, Gaston Berger's quote, what comes from, and quote-unquote expectation are more concrete and indeed better synonyms for past and future, but they are synonyms nonetheless. Just as the physics of elementary actions must find a way to join macroscopic physics, the time of psychological action must be able to everyday time. It does so through the general process of framing auxiliary mechanism or channeled crowds, which we've studied at length. And then he has a diagram here with a kind of the heading is psychological act. There are 4 moments in the first one is undertaking a task in a limited time. Second one is starting the second hand of a watch. We pass through the present. You look at the time on the watch. And the fourth is I finished my task and how long it. And so starting the watch and looking at the watch are part of the movement present. The movement of a clock mechanism or the flow of sand in an hourglass serve as the auxiliary automation for all activities. The psychological activity encompasses everything, but its present moment, accompanied by the physical and statistical present moment of sand flow, or the regulated release of a spring through an escapement, becomes a present, moves along a symbolic line. Its qualitative and primary past-future becomes a linear past-future. In the case of time as well, we could, in theory, do without auxiliary mechanisms and their assemblies, montage, through a psychophysiological setup, or set. The very one, for example, that allows for quote-unquote trace reflexes and serves for the approximate psychological estimation of elapsed time. The interposed automaton, or even the semi-independent play of the psychophysiological set, can only reflect the time of the psychological act by specifying, just as a weighing scale reflects the will to choose based on precision, without having the ability to choose on its own. At the bottom of auxiliary mechanical functions, there would undoubtedly be authentic actions, fundamentally of the same kind as psychological. There are quantum interactions in every expenditure of it, but these elementary actions only intervene in time indicating mechanisms statistically and through a blind game of step-by-step pushes, while encompassing and surveying psychological activity in purposeful. It takes advantage of the linearization of it uses it as a means of precision, but it does not owe to it the inherent past future of all actualization. Okay, so I'll stop. So Ruyer sees the kind of qualitative and experiential past future as primary, but the qualitative and experiential time only kind of has consistency by virtue of enveloping something which is, in a sense, quantitative and statistical. I'm trying to think of an example other than at a watch, I guess. But it seems like for Ruyer, the sand in the hourglass, for instance, ultimately the form of the sand in the hourglass is molecular, but the interaction of a huge number of molecular forms, the behavior of that interaction is statistical. And it is the envelopment of this kind of statistical aggregate, which is...
Yeah, so I think even more fundamentally, there's sort of this, it's kind of mysterious when you think about, like, so you can take a psychological experience of time and maybe a melody here is like the sort of paradigm case, like we discussed many times in the Merleau-Ponty reading, a melody has like a sort of intrinsic temporal dimension in the sense that like if you break it off halfway through, it like feels incomplete, and you have this sort of sense that it's not the melody has been stopped rather than coming to a conclusion. So it has a sort of intrinsic directionality and structure in time. Um, but then, of course, that experience of listening to the melody or playing a melody is not just the sort of isolated, um, abstract, temporal sequence or something like that. Like this experience of listening to the melody is, he points out in another passage, it's happening at the same time as a car is driving by in the street, or the same time as your kettle boils or whatever. All sorts of other processes happening outside that don't have this sort of like intrinsic temporal structure to them in the way that a melody does. So there's a kind of synchronization between this, intrinsic directional structure of time, melody process, and then all these other processes that don't have that character, that they have to be sort of tied to each other temporally in some sense. And like he mentions here, Husserl's sort of time, phenomenology of inner time lectures, and there's similar considerations there, and also in Kant as well. Like this, how do you get from like the question is how do you get from an inner experience of time to time as something happening out in the world that other people can verify and measure and agree or disagree about. And so here he's sort of appealing to this fundamental distinction between these intrinsic forms. So like you mentioned, these sort of molecular forms that exist in the grain of sand, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, these statistical aggregates. So the whole hourglass full of sand has no sort of intrinsic unity. There's nothing that makes one grain of sand sort of care about what is happening to some other grain of sand in this hourglass. Each one is just sort of bumping against the others and being affected by its neighbors. But the whole configuration of the hourglass, the shape of the with one sort of container at the top and then this narrow channel, and then the gravitational pull of the earth that makes the sand fall through that narrow channel in a sort of regular manner. So this whole configuration brings about a statistical property that the passage of sand from the top chamber to the bottom chamber is sort of predictably has a predictable sort of rate of change. And so there's this kind of conjunction, or we have this conjunction between the intrinsic form, which is my sort of inner experience of time, this sort of melodic structure type of experience, and then this statistical episode of the sand in the hourglass flows from the top to the bottom. And I think we have to take it that at least anything other than these fundamental particles has like a kind of coordination of one with the other. So these fundamental particles, if we assume that there is such a thing as a particle that is not itself composed of anything else, then these particles would have this sort of intrinsic form that would not be sort of conjoined with a statistical aggregate of smaller forms or lower level forms. But then every other sort of layer would have one sort of inner side where it would be this kind of intrinsic melodic structure kind of process going on, and then would also have this kind of aggregate side. That process is occurring through these aggregate this aggregate of more fundamental processes that have this sort of general statistical property. But yeah, so I think so in the case of a human being sitting, maybe you're timing, I don't know how long it takes you to brush your teeth or something trivial like that, but you have like sort of the inner experience of the flow of time through this this action, and then you also have the statistical aggregate, which is the sand in your hourglass is flowing at a certain rate based on the configuration of the hourglass, and then these two are sort of linked to each other in the sense that you can use the statistical aggregate of the hourglass to measure the duration of your psychological process. But it's very like this is all very, I think, mysterious. Like it's hard to yeah, it seems like there's this kind of intrinsic duality of these two sides of this sort of inner time experience, and then this statistical aggregate of outer time. But then even more mysterious, I guess, is it's not just a sort of psychological versus physical distinction, because we can also measure time or estimate the duration just sort of internally in a psychological sense. You can sort of maybe rather than using your hourglass to measure how long it takes you to brush your teeth, you sort of like watch yourself brushing your teeth and sort of guess, oh, that took 2.5 minutes or whatever. You can make a sort of estimate of how long it takes, and these are not super accurate, of course, when you compare them to measurements that do involve some sort of physical process like a clock. But you can distinguish between something that takes 5 minutes and something that takes an hour, pretty reliably, unless you're in some sort of like drug altered state or something. So you can make these estimates at least at a fairly coarse grain of duration. So you're sort of like creating a process within yourself that mirrors or that sort of approximates to something like the grain of sand or the sand in the hourglass, flowing through the channel at a regular rate. So you're doing something within yourself. You're setting up this sort of psychological approximation to an hourglass within yourself, and then you're using that to sort of gauge, how long a certain task took or how long this experience lasted. So there's a even within a sort of psychological realm, there's both the sort of intrinsic temporality of a melody, and also this sort of aggregate sort of duration, sort of this aggregate sort of measure of a duration. So they can both happen, within the realm of a psychological sort of within a psychological realm, and not just sort of in a sort of psychological versus physical distinction.
Yeah, I agree that there's something mysterious about how these two registers are supposed to be working together, as Ruyer has explained them. I've been reading a bit about Leibniz recently, and the development of Leibniz's thought from the position that souls basically are just kind of the form taking of bodies, to a later, at least more apparently idealistic thought, in which there is this kind of disjunction between the monad as a simple form and the, I guess, discrete aggregate that constitutes the body of the monad. Thinking about that distinction with respect to Ruyer, both Ruyer's account here and Leibniz's later account, it's difficult for me to see how the monad in Leibniz's case and the true form in Ruyer's case really relates to the kind of the body of the form, or the extended substances that it is perceiving. And it's easier for me to wrap my head around this idea that the form taking is a kind of is a sort of process of the body itself over time, which, I mean, in the case of the grains of sand, for instance, at whatever level of decomposition, the grains would be true forms, which would be sort of form-taking activities. And there would be real form-taking activities, and would, that I guess objectivity of the form taking make it easier to explain how a large aggregate of such activities might give rise to statistical. Yeah, because otherwise, I don't know. It seems like a kind of dualism. We have machines on the one hand, and these transtemporal formal essences on the other.
Yeah, the Leibniz connection is an interesting one because I think with Leibniz, it's hard to pin him down. I think in terms of like what exactly the sort of monadology picture is depicting, because we have this sort of So on the one hand, you have each monad is sort of representing the universe within itself. And so each, as he says, the monads don't have windows, that the properties could climb in and out of. So each monad is sort of like running its own sort of internal program. It has its own sort of intrinsic temporal development, and it has no, connection to anything happening outside of itself. But then at the same time, of course, if there's, me as a monad, this sort of experience flow happening in me, that experience flow is somehow is sort of tied to the various things that are going on outside of that one monad. Obviously the rest of the monads that make up my body and all the other things that affect me and in sort of the everyday sense of the term. And his sort of explanation for this is just of course the pre-established harmony that everything is just all synchronized in such a way that we have this sort of the flow of experiences that make up the monad that is me are sort of synchronized to the flow of experiences that make up, I don't know, the molecule, one of the molecules in my desk, for example, and all the whatever interactions there are between when I sort of touch the desk and change the state of one of those molecules. If we describe it from this sort of more sort of everyday perspective or external perspective, we can sort of flip the perspective and just treat that as the inner development of one monad is sort of synchronized with the inner development of the other monad. So there's like I guess the question here is like what exactly this synchronization consists in, because of course me as a monad, I don't experience the synchronization of my flow of experience with the other monad's flow of experience. I only experience my own sort of inner flow of the process of development of myself as a monad. So it seems like we need something outside to sort of experience that synchronization. And then for Leibniz, of course, we have the God as the monad of monads, that within which all these other flows of experience, all these other monads are sort of the synchronization is experienced. But then it seems like all these other monads are kind of superfluous or illusory in some sense, that like it's really only just God as the one monad in which all the other monads are sort of represented, that is that's real. So I guess the question here is like, to what extent Ruyer also needs some sort of form of forms in which all these other forms would sort of like the synchronization between the forms. So all the inner form of the electron within that grain of sand is synchronized with the inner form that is me as a entity having experience. It does not require some sort of form of forms that within which both of those forms would be contained or incorporated or something like that. So I think there's reason not to be that satisfied with an answer that there's this sort of one form to rule them all that sort of incorporates everything, and the sort of experience that we have of being a form that is not all encompassing is an illusion, that the individuality of a person or an electron or whatever it is like ultimately an illusion, and everything is actually just this one form. I think that's not a very satisfying answer.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe a different sort of line of Leibniz's thought, which is, as you mentioned, hard to pin down, because it's broken up into a million letters. But the idea that each form, or like form taking, contracts the whole, seems to maybe could go some way towards explaining this coordination problem. Like if each grain of sand does in some sense care what the other grains of sand are doing, and also obscurely, as he puts it, everything else, then there would maybe be some kind of if each form taking contracts the whole, or expresses the whole universe, then they would maybe be necessarily coordinated. But as you pointed out, the denial of causality and the idea that properties can't be transferred between monads does seem to necessitate the pre-established harmony.
Yeah, and then this sort of doctrine of this obscure perception. I mean, yeah, it has its own problems in the sense that obscure perception is not any easier to understand than a clear perception would be, in the sense that my experience of as if I were being affected by the sunlight, for example, that I can feel the warmth of as we would describe it in a sort of everyday sense, from a sort of Leibniz perspective. Of course, the monads that make up the sun are running their own sort of internal development, and they have no windows to send these sort of effects to the monad that makes up me. So this is a sort of a clear perception in a sense, but like talking about these monads, I don't know, that are in some star in Andromeda that I've never heard of, and have no sort of interaction with in the normal sense, to suggest that there really is some sort of perception of those stars, because they have this infinitesimal gravitational influence on me or whatever, that sort of goes towards it. So that it doesn't really, like, taking something that would be a clear perception and making it into this obscure perception doesn't really help make the position clearer. But I think maybe like some of the examples that Leibniz gives when he's talking about this distinction between clear and obscure is actually pretty relevant here, because he talks about like the when you hear the sound of the sea, and he says we are sort of, that somehow when you hear the sound of the sea, we are sort of taking, like, each of the little drops of water is sort of contributing towards this sound of the sea that we're hearing, and so we have this sort of obscure perception of each drop of water, and so here we can make a very clear connection with this notion of a statistical aggregate. So my experience, like, I don't, if I just sort of describe my inner experience, I of course don't sort of have a clear perception of the contribution of one drop of water to the whole sound of the sea, but my experience of the sea, the waves crashing and so on, is in some way composed of all the interactions of these drops of water with each other, with the air, etc. But yeah, how do we get from the clear perception, or from a clear perception, not my clear perception, but a clear perception of the the interaction of this one drop of water with the with the beach or the rocky shore or whatever, and the very small amount of noise that one drop of water makes. How do we get from that to the experience that I have as a normal sized human being that would not hear that one tiny sound of the drop of water, but instead hears the sort of general crashing of the waves in this huge statistical aggregate? How do you get from one to the other? Like, how do these tiny perceptions sort of compose with each other to make the one aggregate perception? So I think that's sort of a key problem that Leibniz doesn't really solve so much as sort of like point to God as the monad of monads, that kind of is a name for the solution, to a name for the fact that these monads all sort of combine in the appropriate way. and I'm not sure Ruyer has a solution to that problem either. But yeah, this is a pretty cool passage because you can see like how you get from the seemingly straightforward, you know, description of an hourglass or something that's like sort of a concrete problem of what is the relationship between a sort of inner flow of time and then these outer processes by means of which we can measure these flows of time, and then we get into all these very difficult problems about individuation, the unity of the world versus the separate being of the individual entities and so on. Yeah, so like this one sort of seemingly straightforward or at least well delineated problem, kind of like when you start looking into it, you sort of realize that it connects to all these other very obscure and difficult problems that are sort of like universal, like in the sense that like it's not just a sort of one problem that you can sort of delineate, but it just sort of like leads off into every direction. Yeah, we got to get some fresh air inside the monads. Oh, and actually, that comes to mind that maybe sort of a coincidence, but Husserl's Cartesian meditations, of course, are also a sort of monadology. And so we have the Husserl flow of time stuff in this passage, and then there's also the monadology in the Cartesian meditations. So yeah, I don't know what exactly the connection is, but yeah, there's a sort of like Leibniz thread that is underlying a lot of this stuff. Okay, so we've done like one passage for the first half hour plus of this. 61. Would you be able to read the next bit? We are on page 127 at physicists have always.
Okay, am I coming through?
Yeah, it's good.
Physicists have always somewhat mocked the philosophical subtleties concerning the nature of time because they know very well that the philosopher himself will have to consult his watch. Eddington, for example, imagines a discussion between Bergson and the Astronomer Royal. I rather think that the philosopher would have had the best of the verbal argument. After showing that the Astronomer Royal's idea of time was quite nonsensical, Professor Bergson would probably end the discussion by looking at his watch and rushing off to catch a train which was starting by the Astronomer Royal's time. Similarly, Berger's paper on the mythical nature of time, recorded in the Bulletin de la Société Française de Philosophie, begins with the sentence, "The session is open at 4:30 p.m." and the speaker apologizes with fully conscious irony for having to stay within the limits of the time allotted to him to prove to his listeners that time is a myth. However, it is the philosophical analyses that are ultimately correct. The Astronomer Royal's time, or the time of the physicist of thermodynamics, is only an auxiliary time, and it is as illegitimate to consider it as fundamental as it is to consider automata as providing the true model of living being. The man who consults his watch seems to recognize the primacy of mechanical time, but this is not the case. Man has only made timepieces and clocks to serve as auxiliaries to his intuitive time. Clocks, like all machines, are only the extension of psychophysiological organs or sets, and are nothing without the living organism. The psychobiological actualization, the primary past future, is not a simple functioning in time, it makes time. It involves creative information, which the present of the functioning can only mimic. That is why there is an absolute sense of time, even when the framed mechanisms are mechanically reversible. Two men conversing on the phone do not reverse the direction of time each time one of them listens after speaking and becomes passive after being active. Beyond the physical communication carried out along the line, there is creative actualization, both when an interlocutor listens and when he speaks, because he must realize the meaning. The man who consults his watch is like the man who takes a night train, in which he will sleep until it arrives. He consciously and voluntarily subordinates himself temporarily to a mechanism that he has created. If my alarm clock wakes me up in the morning, it is because in the evening I wanted to be woken up at a certain time, wound up the mechanism, and adjusted the alarm hand accordingly. Time in general, as opposed to the mechanisms that measure it, is not at the disposal of man. My consciousness frames the time of my watch, which I bought to know the time, and which other men have made, but my psychobiological organism, capable of unifying a multitude of auxiliary functions and, quote, making time in its own domain, is also in turn dominated by centers of activity larger than its own, for which the lives of individuals must represent a kind of statistical flow, similar to what cell metabolism is for the dominant eye. The speaker who chooses to subordinate himself to clock time in order to give a lecture on the mythical nature of time or the man who sets his alarm for 7 o'clock in order to be awakened the next day cannot choose not to age and die, and not to be themselves in their organic and psychological life, framed by the generations that preceded them and will follow them. There is nothing new or unexpected about this, since, as we have indicated, the framing pattern can exist at multiple levels, going up to the absolute frame, passing through the living species whose individuals are in a sense only subordinate organs or cells. These multiple levels of agents or centers of activity are naturally constituents of concrete moments in time, actual moments, and more or less extensive qualitative past-future times. We survive ourselves just as the human species survives us. Finally, the absolute frame is not in time, although it is the ultimate source of all actualization.
Yeah, so this is getting at what we were sort of discussing, this question of the coordination of these sort of different intrinsic forms. So we have this distinction between the framed and the framing that he's used throughout this book. When I, in this example of, when I set my alarm clock for the morning, I mean, he's obviously talking about like a mechanical clock here where you have to wind up the mechanism, but the same thing applies when you set a timer on your phone. So you set an alarm, which sort of is tied to this external time coordination. If we're talking about like our phones, it involves satellites and cell towers and all this sort of electromagnetic radiation being used to transmit signals from one location to another and so on. It's an extremely complicated system of coordination, but it involves this kind of external timing. And I think when we talk about these atomic clocks that sort of provide the basic sort of standard for these time signals, that involves a statistical process of radioactive decay. So it's again sort of ultimately based on this statistical time that we know that this substance has a radioactive decay process that happens in this regular manner, and then we're sort of taking that regular radioactive decay as a standard by means of which we measure time and coordinate time of all these other processes. But yeah, so we have this sort of trivial action that you're going to bed, you set an alarm at a certain time in the morning, and then of course you go to sleep and you don't have experience of the passage of time, and then the alarm rings and you wake up. So here we are, my sort of experience of going to bed and then being woken up by the alarm is framed by the very complicated technical process by means of which my phone is connected to the general reference system of time that is ultimately based on this statistical process of radioactive decay of cesium or whatever substance is being used. So my sort of experience is framed by this mechanical process or this machine process. But then, of course, that sort of experience of being woken up by the alarm clock is itself framed by my decision. I want to wake up at X time tomorrow morning. As a sort of conscious being, I have made a decision about what I want to happen tomorrow morning, and I arrange a certain technical device, namely my phone, to operate in such a way as to bring about that result in the morning. And you can keep sort of alternating from the framing and framed aspects here. Like, so my decision that I want to wake up at a certain time in the morning is probably related to, like, maybe I have to be at work at a certain time or at school or whatever it is. And that is a kind of so my decision, my framing decision to set the alarm clock is itself framed by some other sort of social obligations that I have, that I'm involved in. But then, of course, my decision to work at a certain place or go to school is also something that I've, made at another time. I've sort of framed my, life course in such a way as to obligate myself to be at work at a certain time, et cetera, et cetera. So you can just keep sort of alternating and going up different levels. And then he suggests here that we can sort of ascend to the highest level, and we have this absolute frame, which would be this kind of intrinsic form of the whole universe, I guess, in the sense that there's nothing outside of it that would frame it. That if we take the universe to be everything that exists, of course, there's nothing outside of it that sort of sets the reference within which the universe is developing in time. And this connects with what we were talking about with Leibniz and this, monad of monads. So we've gone from the court at Hanover to The Hague. I don't. I guess it's because The Hague has like the international court that in which everything is governed. Is that the idea?
I just meant that we've become Spinozists.
Oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, So Leibniz, of course, with working for the rulers of Hanover, and then Spinoza, having this sort of universal, sort of intrinsic development of the universe. So I think this sort of alternation of framing and framed does help a little bit with this problem of coordination, that we can it's not a sort of purely dualistic system in the sense that we just have like these two sort of kinds of time that would be like sort of opposing each other. Instead, we have this sort of like intertwining of the two, in the sense that each sort of aggregate time, each sort of statistical process, like the case of my phone having this connection to the decay of some radioactive substance, each of those is sort of framed by another intrinsic time, and then each intrinsic time flow or time process is also framed by another aggregate time. And it seems like for Ruyer, we have intrinsic time at both ends of this sort of giant scale of nature. We have like the fundamental particles, whatever they are. Electrons, as far as we know, are intrinsic are fundamental particles that are not made up of anything else. And then there, this whole sort of zoo of other particles. But each of these particles is itself an intrinsic form that is not that doesn't frame any other sort of aggregate beneath it. And then at the top end, we have this absolute frame that frames everything. So we have these sort of intrinsic processes at both ends of the scale, and then in between we have this intertwining of the framing and the framed. So it's a little bit. I think we've made some progress in understanding, but it's still. I think the position that there is an absolute frame and there is an intrinsic fundamental particle, framing, is all, that assertion is also hard to I guess justify. It seems like we have to either sort of accept it or not. And then there's a question. To be is to be perceived. It does seem that we're still left with this absolute frame as being sort of the one fundamental, ultimate reality. And then each of us as a what appears to be a sort of intrinsic reality, this intrinsic flow of experience, etc., is in some sense secondary to this absolute frame. It seems like we haven't really succeeded at accounting for both individuation of entities and connection of those entities. That it seems like we have to sort of choose between individuation or connection, and we haven't really succeeded in getting both to work together at the same time.
It may be a related issue in Ruyer's thought for me is this idea that previously he's talked about consciousness as a kind of an operation of conversion from the world of forms, basically, values and essences, to actual perception. And the way that is supposed to happen, the way we're supposed to get from the essence to the actualization, is still pretty obscure to me, and seems related to this in the sense that this quasi-dualism, it's not entirely clear how we go from psychological involvement to what is invoked. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe in comparison to Ruyer, maybe I'm finding Simon's ontology a bit easier to picture. How these form taking processes relate to kind of that with respect to which they are form takings. Although some of the arguments in favor of this kind of transtemporal world of essences or values that Ruyer has given so far have also pretty convincing. Yeah, I don't know if there's a way to kind of split the difference between Simondon and Ruyer, but I'd be interested to hear it.
Yeah, the bit about actualization, I think, is a good thing to bring in here, because it does seem that this actualization of an idea or a form has something to do with the sort of passage through one of these aggregates. Like if we picture some value or essence or this sort of transtemporal form that had no connection to any aggregate, clock time or anything like that. It seems like this is sort of a purely this is a sort of purely ideal essence, and for this essence to become actual, it has to have some connection to a clock time. You have to be able to say that this essence is being actualized, at this point of the hourglass being emptied or whatever. So it does seem like what he's describing as this actualization of an essence is connected in some way to the relationship between forms, these intrinsic forms, and these statistical aggregates, but it's not super clear, I think, at this point of the book, what exactly that connection is supposed to be. Okay, so we've come to the end of a chapter. We can either stop here or continue to the beginning of the next one. What does everyone think? We can aggregate all our internal positions on this and arrive at a statistical combination. Okay, we have a contrary. The statistical aggregate has not resulted in a coherent position. Coin flip. We can introduce some randomness into the process to bring about a result. Let me just see if there's let me just skip ahead and see if there's like a section we could read through. Okay, so we have two very short sections and then one long one. So that's kind of not ideal for that. Maybe we can just read the first two short ones and then discuss and then stop there. Okay, so I can read the first bit here. Chapter 8, The Mixed Origin of Information. The study of information machines gives us the positive certainty that information comes from a source that is transmechanical and, in the etymological sense of the word, metaphysical. But throughout this work, we haven't been able to avoid doing a lot of metaphysics, not only in the etymological sense, but in the ordinary sense of the word. And the thesis of transmechanical information encounters a very serious objection, the same one that can be made against any kind of Platonism, namely against any explanation that appeals to a world of essences, values, or potentials. It would only be a pseudo-explanation by a useless doubling. If information of the actual world, the supply of information machines, is explained by the participation of individuals in some ideas or forms of a transactual world, what is it that informs this transactual world itself? What would we gain by just displacing the problem, the dilemma? We know with what vigor Emile Meyerson has emphasized this dilemma. Either we understand a phenomenon by reducing it to a pure identity, by deducing from other phenomena the elements of novelty that it seems to contain, or we admit that novelty is absolute and give up on understanding. We also know how Meyerson refused to allow attempts to conceal the dilemma with a pseudo, quote, third solution, unquote, recourse to the, quote, state of potentiality, unquote, with which we would fabricate a semblance of explanation where identity is clearly missing. The conception of information and the origin of information that we have opposed to that of cybernetics seems at first sight to be a pseudo-solution of this type. The man who composes a message or improvises an action, the organism that develops through self-structuration, or the beings that assemble themselves cannot be explained by the functioning of assemblies or feedback mechanisms, but we maintain that they are regulated by means of axiological feedback passing through a transspatial world. As a strict disciple of Meyerson might object, what difference is there between preformation and epigenesis if epigenesis is conceived as a preformation in which the form exists in advance, not in space, but in a transspatial world? Solutions to the dilemma. Despite appearances, there are very few philosophical theories of the origin of information because when faced with this problem, the human mind always goes around in the same circle. We can distinguish the following. 1. Idealist theories of the Platonic type, according to which information in the sensible world is due to some ideal forms that descend into or manifest themselves in one way or another in our world. Despite the different aspects of their philosophies, Plato, Aristotle, and Leibniz adopt this schema. 2. Mechanist theories that reject the idea of a reservoir of transcendent forms and derive information from purely fortuitous combinations of elements existing in our space, or the quote-unquote geometric theories in which the modes derive from a geometric necessity inherent in the nature of things, as in the philosophies of Descartes and Spinoza. 3. Dialectical theories in which new forms appear according to a logical necessity immanent to the unique reality, which spontaneously posits its various moments. It is not very difficult to see that these three types of theories, although seemingly opposed, are in fact similar. These theories sacrifice novelty to rationality and resort to the notion of potentiality. This is obvious for the theory of substantial forms derived from Plato. It is hardly less obvious for the dialectical theories, and Meyerson was quick to emphasize it. Hegel, in his Philosophy of History, speaks of the, quote, spirit whose nature is always one and the same, but which unfolds this its one nature in the phenomena of the world's existence, unquote. New open quote, spirit knows itself. It involves an appreciation of its own nature. Universal history is the exhibition of spirit in the process of working out the knowledge of that which it is potentially. And as the germ bears in itself the whole nature of the tree, so do the first traces of spirit virtually contain the whole of that history, unquote. Third open quote, the concept remains at home with itself in the course of its process, unquote. Hegel writes elsewhere, and, quote, and the process does not posit anything new as regards content, but only brings forth an alteration of form, unquote. It is less apparent, but no less certain, for theories of the Democritean type, as Octave Hamelin has rightly emphasized. Matter takes on, as Descartes says, quote, all possible forms, unquote. The possible then serves as the guide to the information of the world. The Spinozist modes are contained virtually in reality. These three theories adopt the first branch of the Meyersonian dilemma. They want to explain everything, even at the cost of a quote-unquote reduction of novelty. Other theories, generally more recent than the first ones, adopt the second branch of the dilemma. They renounce the attempt to explain everything and allow absolute novelty at the cost of rationality. We can distinguish 1. Theories of pure experience with pluralism, the tychism of William James or C.S. Peirce, and in general, absolute empiricism, which accepts the experience of novelty just like all other experiences. 2. Theories of emergence, C. Lloyd Morgan, Samuel Alexander, contingency, Émile Boutroux, creative evolution, Bergson, and pure freedom, that is, freedom without norms, values, or controlling essences, as understood by existentialism. It is even easier to see the close kinship of these two last types of theories. They reject the notion of potentiality, they distrust concepts and logic, necessity, or determinism. While the three theories of the first type are theories of, quote, metaphysical fullness, unquote, the last two believe in, quote, metaphysical emptiness, unquote, which allows individual and unpredictable adventures, chances in the strong sense of the word, whereas chance in the Democritean and mechanist sense of the word seems to be only completing cases laid out in advance by possibilities. Our own study of the origin of information through cybernetics has clearly led us toward theories of the first Platonic type. How can we avoid the serious objections that it is so easy to put to this type of theory, especially that of, quote, useless doubling, unquote, and that our contemporaries who are in general more seduced by novelty at the cost of rationality than by rationality at the cost of novelty continue to emphasize? Oh, I think I went through the two short sections and got into the long section, so I'll stop here. Yeah, there's no section break. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot going on in this. Yeah, I know, it's just getting to the good part. Yeah, there's a lot going on in this first bit. So we have essentially like a sort of schema for the whole history of philosophy in like one page, which is a lot. So the question is, or the question he starts with here is, we want to explain, why it is that there is in the world something like information, order, organization, pattern, whatever term we want to use. And we have these sort of Platonist in the broad sense approaches that say that, this order that we see in the physical world, in the world that we experience, etc., is sort of a manifestation of this, intrinsically ordered world of forms. And then the question, of course, is, if that's the case, then where does the order of the world of forms come from? If the physical world needs this world of forms, outside of it to sort of introduce order into it, then why does the world of forms not need sort of a meta form world to introduce order into it. And so it seems like we either have to accept like some sort of ascending hierarchy of worlds in which each one provides the forms for the next one, or procession from the one. Yeah, that's where we're going to end up, I think. But yeah, or we have to sort of accept that one of these layers has the capacity to order itself, to provide itself with order, and doesn't require something outside itself from which the order would derive. But then if that's the case, if we have this self-ordering or intrinsic order at one level, then it's not clear why we would need to even go beyond the first one. Like what's the necessity of having this order be introduced to the physical world from this world of forms, if that world of forms itself is capable of has this intrinsic order, or doesn't require another layer to from which its order would be derived. If that can happen in the world of forms, why can't it happen in the physical world and avoid the world of forms altogether? So that's sort of the dilemma that he's starting from. And so he gives sort of this sort of schematic indication of like various ways you can try to solve this kind of problem. So we have these idealist theories where, as I was saying earlier, the pattern or structure that we observe in the world is the result of, or derives from this sort of ideal world of patterns or forms, and somehow these forms are sort of manifested or introduced into our world, or the entities in our world participate in these forms, or however exactly, whatever image you want to use for this process or interaction. And then the sort of second position is a kind of negation of this notion of pattern or structure, in the sense that ultimately what exists is just the sort of mechanical interaction of elements of our world. So in a sort of most straightforward presentation of this position, it would just be these corpuscles, these kind of tiny bodies that just sort of bump into each other, and everything that we observe is just the result of these mechanical interactions of these tiny particles. All the biological patterns we observe, and human capacity to invent and create and so on, these are all just complicated interactions of these tiny billiard balls bumping into each other. And then the third one is this dialectical approach, where it's sort of there's a sort of intrinsic progression of forms that sort of leads from one form to the next. So it's not that we have this sort of static realm of forms that are in some way manifested in physical reality. Instead, we have this sort of development of forms, that's sort of intrinsic development of the forms themselves. And Ruyer groups these three solutions together as theories that sort of eliminate novelty in favor of explanation or rationality. So in each case, we are sort of taking some seeming appearance of novelty, or seeming, in the case of like sort of his I think sort of core example is like, the embryo that develops into an organism. So you have this undifferentiated egg that, in which we have this sort of novel appearance of a form, or seemingly novel appearance of a form, namely the organic structure of the hatched chick, if it's a chicken egg, etc., or the adult oak tree if it's an acorn, whatever it is. In any case, we start from something undifferentiated, unstructured, etc., and then we have differentiation and structure that seem to arise. And in each case, these three theories, they all sort of eliminate that seeming novelty, in the sense that the end state with this differentiated structure, pattern, etc., is kind of implicitly there from the outset. It's just a question of taking something that was not apparent, in the undifferentiated embryo or whatever, and then having that sort of differentiation or pattern become apparent later on. And then the sort of other category of theories is the one that sort of holds on to the novelty side and sacrifices explanation or rationality to novelty. So he talks. I mean, the two sort of categories he gives here are maybe not that distinct from each other. So he gives. So the one is this sort of theory of pure experience, as what he describes it as. So this will be one in which the experience of novelty is sort of taken to be just as valid as any other experience. So it's just, we do have an experience of novelty. We do sort of perceive things happening in a sort of surprising way. And this is just a sort of fact about the world. So I'm not sure. I mean, he sort of identifies William James and C.S. Peirce, which maybe is not that, or is at least something that would be debatable. Because I think Peirce might fit more under the second category of the theories of emergence or contingency. So this was some account in which there is a sort of intrinsic freedom at work in the world, in the sense that it's a freedom that is not sort of guided by some set of pre-existing values. And this is existentialism that he points to here is sort of like the sort of purest form of this theory, where of course there's this kind of intrinsic freedom, this or sort of absolute freedom that is not sort of there's a kind of decision that is not based on sort of weighing of outcomes or values or any other sort of it's not based on something that pre-exists the decision. It's a kind of pure decision. So these two types of theories are grouped together in the sense that they insist on, and Sartre is probably the one he's thinking of here, who's like maybe the most sort of straightforward proponent of this kind of like absolute freedom. So we have this sort of two big categories of approaches to this problem, which is either we insist on rationality and the capacity to explain something, and then we sort of lose novelty, that like the apparent novelty is really just apparent, and then ultimately there's something that was there all along that is only being sort of manifested or revealed, or it's a sort of a program that is being run through, but the program was there from the beginning. Or on the other hand, we have this sort of holding on to novelty, but then we lose the capacity for explanation or rationality. And in the sort of purest form, we just have this absolute freedom, this absolute decision that is not sort of based on anything that existed before that decision. So even something like weighing options and choosing the one that seems most likely to come to the right to result in the desired outcome, or choosing the one that is that fits some pre-existing set of values best. In each of these cases, you would have something that pre-exists the decision, but then we are this is not this kind of absolute decision where it would just be this pure decision that doesn't have any basis on anything that pre-exists the decision. These are sort of the two big categories of options that he's sort of setting out. And I guess his approach is, of course, a Platonic one, in the sense that he is talking about forms, but I think he's going to try to give us a way of getting, having our cake and eating it too, that we get explanation and novelty at the same time. But I don't actually remember what his argument is for how we can do that. So I guess we'll have to stay tuned.
Surprised to see the old Bergson is an irrationalist argument from Ruyer. Seems like he should be on the Bergson team.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is obviously a very sort of coarse-grained sort of like view from 1,000 feet up, depiction of history of philosophy. He's sort of like taking 2,500 years worth of complicated interactions and like thousands of pages of text, and sort of compressing it into like these 3 paragraphs or whatever. A lot of these identifications of a person with a specific tendency are pretty questionable. And I think even I'm sure he would probably accept that each of these people probably incorporates elements of different categories here. That maybe there's one that is like maybe there's one that is sort of the dominant one that each of these philosophers is sort of taking as most fundamental or primary or whatever. But in sort of developing their theory, they're probably sort of accounting for some of these other. They're probably using elements of these other categories to sort of flesh out their sort of one fundamental principle. Okay, so yeah, I think maybe this is a good place to stop, and we can all sort of figure out how to achieve novelty and rationality at the same time. So that's everyone's homework for the week. Come back and give us a solution next week.
You'll never expect it, but we will be able to explain it.
Right. But then we also need to be able to explain how you arrived at the novel solution. So yeah.
Which will itself be completely unexpected.
Right. Okay. Cool. Yeah, this is I think we're getting to like probably the most interesting parts of this book, I think. Yeah, so this is cool. All right. Yeah, so thanks everyone. And yeah, hope to see you next week.
Thanks, Don. Thanks everyone. See you next week.